Good morning. I'd like to share my views on recent newspaper stories, what happened with Monash University, where IVF patients share horror stories amid Monash embryo bungle. So to start with, can't quite comprehend how something so tiny could become a huge bungle. By way of welcome disclaimer, my name is James Danger. I have a PhD in embryology and with more than 50 years of experience. The videos I'm making for this channel are my attempt to bridge the gap between information you may need for your fertility treatment and the most recent publications available to your staff, to the clinic staff. I'm not a medical person, and this information is not medical advice, but it may help you in knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor, and maybe to help in understanding the advice that you receive. This page is allocated to supporters of IVF Daily. I'm just starting out, but if you want to promote your company or clinical product, this may be just the place. It's good to remember that if your support may mean that an IVF client becomes a better informed IVF client, you can click subscribe or become a sponsor or just make a donation to help others on their fertility journey. Better yet, show your support on my attached GoFundMe page or visit the CPD modules on my Patreon page. So let's just acknowledge at the very outset that the transfer of an incorrect embryo is bad. It's bad for the child. It's bad for the couple who received the embryo. It's bad for the couple who created and wanted the embryo. It's bad for the clinic. It's bad for the scientists involved. It's bad for the industry, but it's good for newspapers, social media. I thought I might just start by describing the system that most clinics use, the checks and balances we need to validate all the different parts of the program, and to give some confidence of what happens in IVF clinic is really very, very good. In the 50 years of IVF and the millions and millions of transfers, the number of incorrect transfers made public, you could count on one hand. It's safer to have IVF than catch a plane. In all fairness, the only reason why this was made public was because the clinic was a public company and the rules of disclosure made them disclose it. Maybe there are more instances of incorrect transfers that the public are not aware of. So where to start? Just so you know, the embryo is tiny and the storage tanks they're held in are huge. Finding the sample can be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Of course, each sample is labelled and the location is well documented. It's just accessing can be very, very difficult. And there are just so many samples. There should be regular audits to confirm whether the patient records are correct, but trying to audit these huge tanks is an enormous task. The embryos are stored in these large tanks full of liquid nitrogen. As you know, liquid nitrogen is dangerous, and if you breathe it in, you can die basically without oxygen. So accessing the tanks is not trivial. Accessing the tanks to find one sample is something to be done as quickly as possible. So generally speaking, what are the checks and balances? Excuse me, you can start it by saying that each individual has a unique ID code. Sometimes the male and female partners have the same ID code, and sometimes more recently they would have separate codes. Any donors involved in the treatment would have their own ID codes, and sometimes the donor gamete or donor embryos would also have their ID codes. Samples can stay in cryostorage for many, many years, although in some countries there are limits, but still up to 10 years. Remember, there was a 30-year-old baby born just recently, but those embryos have been in storage for 30 years. In reality, all this information is tracked through the patient management system, which varies from sometimes very simple to very, very complex systems. So for every treatment cycle, there is a new ID or date or some other code, and it defines the female and the male clients and any other donor IDs. There will be a sperm sample ID, usually the males, but sometimes it may be a donor or could be both. There will be a ID for the egg collection with the female's ID, or there could be an egg freeze or an egg thaw if it's an donor egg recipient cycle. There will be a fertilization ID with both the ID of the egg and the sperm. The treatment ID will contain details of every egg collected and every embryo generated, nearly always with one sperm ID, but sometimes it's shared between two different sperm IDs. Every egg will have a history of fertilization or no fertilization of fate, Every embryo will have a transfer or a freeze or a discard or a donation ID. Some embryos will have a biopsy and a PGT ID. Every treatment ID will have a media and consumable ID, and every treatment will have several staff IDs of patient and embryology staff who have been in the care. So every step is monitored. For every freeze, there'll be a freeze ID attached to the treatment cycle ID and to the patient's ID. There may actually be more than one freeze per treatment cycle. Every embryo is vitrified individually, though it can be thawed individually. Typically, all the straws or loops or cryosticks, whatever the current technology is being used, are normally housed in a separate container, but if there are many straws, there may be more than one container, and these containers are held in the liquid nitrogen tank. So any freeze ID may have a number of thaw IDs attached to it, as embryos are thawed individually in separate cycles, and it's quite possible that embryos that are thawed go towards an FET cycle may have come from different freezers. Any freeze may have more than one container location. So for any frozen embryo transfer cycle, there'll be a client ID and a new treatment cycle ID. There'll be one or more freeze IDs attached to it. This allocation may not be in the client's ID if the embryos or the eggs or sperm are to be sourced from outside the clinic. So they've been brought in from by courier. The number of embryos to be thawed is usually well documented. When the client transfer date has been set, usually several days' notice, the location of the embryos to be thawed are confirmed in the system and their location identified. On the day of embryo transfer, the embryos are located and removed from the storage tank into a holding tank, and the prescribed embryos are removed, warmed individually, and then moved to a culture system. So then when you get to the point, this is the point where the error occurred, the bungle. This is what the embryologist may see when they try to identify the location of the canes containing the cryoloops. And there could be more than one level to it. The canes, they're usually marked with at least two codes, usually a patient ID or another ID such as the freeze number, etc. The canes containing the stored embryos are transferred to another vessel containing liquid nitrogen, and then at that point they're then validated with the identity of the client and the freeze number, and then check to make sure the straws present in the container match the audit number. At this point, the embryo identity checks are made and must be confirmed by another staff member using the double witness protocol. So at least two people will check the IDs on the straws. More recently, modern systems such as RFIDs or barcode systems to uniquely identify each container and each canister and each straw have become very popular. These are not available in older systems that use cryo markers to mark the canes. One hopes that the same systems will be available years later when they may be warmed. And so these systems have to be available and be able to process 10 to maybe 20 years down the track. After the required number of embryos have been warmed and the embryos safely moved to a culture dish, the cane with the remaining straws are returned or is returned to the same location and the documentation updated to reflect the number of embryos remaining storage. Well, this all sounds very simple and it sounds straightforward. Well, it sort of is. It works, in the general speaking, in a lab it works very, very well. But it's not always that simple. Usually there are very tight time limits between thawing and embryo transfer, and usually there are quite a number of FET transfers done each session. There's considerable pressure unseen by the doctors and nursing staff to have the embryos thawed and ready for transfer at the designated time. And often these processes occur 7 days a week and there are significant staffing issues. The embryologist performing the thawing may have other duties to perform at the same time, and the embryologist performing the embryo transfer may or might be the same person doing the thaw. The scientists performing the witnessing should always be a different staff member, but if working alone are allowed to self-witness, which is not encouraged, small clinics may only have one staff member rostered on during the weekend. If all the remaining embryos are returned to cryo storage but in a different location, then all those files need to be updated. And you can start to get a sense that there's a lot of paperwork involved. But there are also very quirky ones which make the process somewhat complicated. One is, of course, reciprocal IVF, usually with lesbian couples, where each partner produces some embryos, but they are swapped at transfers to the other partner. This is an example where the database system and the file details can become very complicated and very complex, since when frozen, the couple's IDs will be the same, just in different freeze numbers. It depends on how the data system works. And you can see that these systems are at high risk. There are many other examples where the normal data relationships vary and require the deviations to be standard protocols to be clearly highlighted. It's not an excuse, but it's a higher level of risk. At the very least, the freezing tool, the straw that contained the embryo with the ID on it, should be made available to the clinician and the patient prior to transfer to verify themselves that they're correct, since they're the one that pays the insurance and carries the risk. The tanks are subject to regular audits and to verify the data system and notes align with what is in the tank, but this is often challenging and very difficult. It is part of a quality management system of audit schedules, but it is very difficult to go through a tank and remove each cane, check, and then put them back. And just on the comment of how much is happening, this is a graph from the Australian MPSU 2002 data set, just illustrating how many freezing cycles are occurring in Australia. So in 2022, out of 55,000 odd pickup cycles, more than half of those cycles did not have a transfer. They all went into cryo storage, either as eggs for fertility preservation or for freezing after pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where the samples have to be frozen and then verified. So what happens in this case is that more than half of all their collections were frozen without a transfer. Many will have a transfer, but also will have embryos frozen. And my comment is, when I looked at this graph, is that's a lot of eggs and embryos going to storage. It's a huge number. They have to go somewhere, and they'll be in there for 1 month to 6 months to 2 years to 10 years. What we should do is acknowledge that there is a very low risk of error. It's not zero, but it's a very low risk of error in mixing up the samples. After all, 2% of all children are not conceived by the male partner. 4 to 8% of criminal convictions are overturned, and planes do crash. Actually, showing the clients the straw is the very best way to demonstrate the risk is very, 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 very low. If you look at the consequences, though, one error. Look at this case, Monash share prices has fallen by half, potential loss of trade, worldwide outrage, and a loss of faith in the IVF process. I sometimes think we have created a problem with so much cryo storage, infinitely more than what it was 10 years ago, especially with the introduction of PGTA and fertility preservation. I think the staff will often be under considerable stress, and they run the risk of burnout that's not appreciated by other members of staff. One consequence will be that the staff just decide to work elsewhere. There is already a shortage of skilled embryologists, underpaid compared to the clinicians, but they accept huge responsibility. I'm sure that the life of the staff members whose signature is linked to these two events has already been changed forever. I know that the recipients have also, but you have to think of the staff as well. In one case, I think the action involved an error that occurred several years ago, but no one was aware. And the second one, I think, involved a reciprocal IVF process of mixing up which embryos should have been thawed and transferred. So I'd just like to finish up by saying, I think we should acknowledge that the transfer of an incorrect embryo is very bad. It's very rare. You hardly ever hear about it. Only, as I said, you'll count on one hand. It's bad for the baby, the child. It's bad for the couple receiving the embryo. It's bad for the couple who created and wanted the embryo. It's bad for the IVF clinic. It's bad for the scientists. It's bad for the industry, but it is good for the newspaper and social media. There are no winners in this situation. Once again, I'd like to thank you for persevering to the end of the video. IVF is a very personal journey that involves the action of many different steps and people. It helps to understand all aspects of that journey, and I hope this information may have been of value. If you like it, please tell others about the service and please subscribe. Thank you.